In 1778, a British general named Henry Clinton commanded one of the most formidable fighting forces in the world. 20,000 soldiers, seasoned regulars, the finest military machine that England had ever put into the field. And yet, in a Georgia swamp that most of his officers didn't even know existed, he would lose something far more valuable than any battle. He would lose the confidence of his own men, he would lose the faith of the crown, and he would do it all without firing a single shot in anger. Most people know the American Revolution as the story of Washington's genius, Franklin's diplomacy, and the miracles that saved the Continental Army at Trenton and Valley Forge. But there is another story, one that very few Americans learn in school, and one that British historians have quietly buried for over 200 years. It is the story of how a single decision made by a commander who never even saw the battlefield ended up costing the British Empire something that no musket fire could ever take back: the psychological victory. And the man responsible wasn't a general. He wasn't even a trained military strategist. He was a country doctor from North Carolina named Thomas Blount. Broke, starving, working with resources that would make a modern soldier laugh. But he possessed something far more dangerous than any cannon. He possessed an absolute understanding of terrain, disease, and the breaking point of the human body. Here is what Clinton thought he knew. The American rebels in Georgia were weak, disorganized, and running out of supplies. There was a supply cache, food, ammunition, medical goods, hidden somewhere inland in a rural settlement controlled by Continental sympathizers. If Clinton could send a strike force to seize it, he would cut off the rebel supply line, demoralize the local militia, and prove to the crown that he could pacify the South without significant losses. It was supposed to be a simple raid, a show of strength, a reminder that the British Empire did not negotiate with rebels. It was supposed to take 4 days. It took 13. But here's where the story becomes something that military academics have ignored for generations. And it is this: the battle that unfolded in that Georgia swamp was not won by superior tactics. It was not won by hidden artillery or clever ambush formations. It was won because Thomas Blount understood a principle of warfare that the British Army, for all its discipline and tradition, had never fully appreciated. He understood that a soldier's will to fight does not live in his musket. It lives in his body. It lives in his ability to eat, to drink, to sleep without fever, to move without sinking to his waist in mud. Thomas Blount took everything the British Army believed about order, discipline, and professional warfare, and he inverted it. He didn't build fortifications. He created a maze of water and disease. He didn't gather an army of his own. He weaponized the land itself. And when the British soldiers finally emerged from that swamp 13 days later, hungry, sick, and shattered, something had broken inside them that ammunition could never have broken. They had fought their way to victory and still felt like they had lost everything. This is the story that the British military establishment worked very hard to forget. Because if they admitted what actually happened, they would have to admit something that contradicted their entire understanding of what made an army powerful. They would have to admit that a broke, starving country doctor had just taught them that professional soldiers are also human beings. That discipline and firepower mean nothing when a man is hungry enough, sick enough, and lost enough in terrain he was never trained to fight in. And that lesson, that realization, spread like fever through the British ranks in the South. Soldiers began to understand that they were not invincible. Officers began to doubt their own invincibility. And in a war that had already stretched their confidence to the breaking point, that doubt became the most contagious disease of all. So what was the actual tactical genius of Thomas Blount? How did an untrained civilian outsmart one of the world's premier military forces? And what happened to Blount after his name was nearly erased from history? That is what we are about to uncover. Thomas Blount was born in 1725 in rural North Carolina, in the rolling country southwest of present-day Guilford. He was not born into wealth or privilege. His father was a middling landowner, the kind of man who owned enough land to matter locally, but not enough to command real influence in colonial society. Medicine in the 1730s and 1740s was not a profession you entered by attending university. You entered it by watching someone practice it, by reading whatever books you could find, and by making mistakes on willing, or desperate, patience until you learned what actually worked and what didn't. Blount trained under a traveling medical man named Samuel Odom, and by all accounts, he was an attentive student. But Odom could teach him anatomy, could teach him which herbs had which properties, could teach him how to amputate without killing the patient from blood loss. What Odom could not teach him was what made the colonial wilderness different from the manicured fields of England. Odom had not been raised in it. Blount had. From childhood, Blount understood water. He understood mud. He understood which insects carried fever, which plants could be eaten and which were poison, which streams ran clean and which stagnated. He understood the rhythm of seasons in the coastal plain and the interior wetlands. And in a way that no European-trained surgeon could, he understood one other thing: the psychological weight of being lost in a landscape that does not forgive mistakes. This distinction matters because it is the key to everything that happened later. Blount was not a military theorist. He was not a commander who had read treatises on the principles of war. He was a backwoods physician who had spent 20 years treating the diseases of people who had no choice but to live in, move through, and survive in terrain that most educated men would have called uninhabitable. By 1775, Blount had established a small practice in the interior of North Carolina. He was not wealthy. Medical practice in rural areas was not lucrative work. Patients paid in vegetables, firewood, and sometimes not at all. But Blount had something more valuable than money. He had knowledge. He had credibility with the local population. And as the war began, he had something else: a choice about which side to serve. The rebel cause in North Carolina was not universally popular. The backcountry was split. There were loyalists, there were patriots, and there were many people who simply wanted to be left alone. But Blount, for reasons that are never fully explained in the sparse historical record, committed himself entirely to the Continental cause. And he did not offer his skills as a battlefield surgeon, which is what you would expect. Instead, he offered something far more unusual. He offered to become a scout, an engineer of terrain itself, and ultimately, a master of environmental warfare. This was 1778. The war had been ongoing for 3 years. The British had won almost every conventional battle in the South. They had captured Charleston. They had dominated the coast. They had proven that when it came to open field combat, their disciplined regiments could defeat anything the Americans could put in front of them. But something was changing, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. And that something was the realization among Continental officers that they did not have to fight the British in open fields. General Henry Clinton was building his reputation on exactly the opposite principle. He believed that conventional warfare would end the rebellion. He believed that if he could occupy key ports and move inland methodically, the rebels would have nowhere to hide. But what Clinton did not understand, what very few commanders on either side truly understood, was that the American wilderness was not a stage on which to perform military tactics. It was a weapon, and the Americans, slowly and painfully, were learning how to use it. Thomas Blount was one of the first to truly understand this at a profound level. In early 1778, Blount learned through his network of sympathizers that the British were planning a major supply raid into the interior of Georgia. They were gathering intelligence on a rebel supply cache, and they were preparing to send what they considered to be a sufficient force to secure it. 400 elite British regulars, commanded by a officer named Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell. Blount knew the terrain. He knew exactly where the British would have to move if they were going to reach the supply cache. And he knew something else, something that would prove to be the key to everything. He knew that the British commander did not understand what it meant to move an army through a Georgia swamp. Now, here is where we have to step back and ask a question that almost no historian has asked. Why did Thomas Blount know the swamp better than the British did? The answer is not as simple as just living there longer. The answer involves something about the structure of knowledge itself, and about how the 18th century British Army understood territory. British military education was based on a very specific model. Read maps, study fortifications, understand geometry and angles of fire, master the set-piece battle. Everything about how the British Army trained its officers was oriented toward understanding space in terms of measurable, mappable, controllable geometry. You could draw it, you could predict it, you could engineer your way through it. A swamp does not work that way. A swamp is by definition unmappable. Its dimensions change with seasons. Its pathways shift depending on water levels. Its dangers are not abstract, they are biological. They are fever, they are parasites. They are insects that carry disease. They are mud that sucks men down. They are water that fills lungs. And none of these things appear on a map. Blount understood this at a level that no amount of military training could have taught. He understood that the real battle in a swamp is not against an enemy army. It is against the fundamental hostility of the environment itself. He understood that you could not march 400 men through a Georgia swamp in formation. You could march them, but they would arrive broken. They would arrive sick. They would arrive questioning everything they believed about their own competence and their commander's wisdom. So Blount made a decision that no one in the historical record explicitly attributes to him, but that every circumstance suggests was the fruit of his planning. He would not try to stop the British with soldiers. He would stop them with terrain, and more than that, he would use the psychology of terrain, the way that a landscape can demoralize an army as surely as any ambush, to make victory meaningless even if they achieved it tactically. This requires understanding a concept that most military strategists do not spend much time on: the difference between winning a battle and winning the confidence of your soldiers. The British could defeat the Continental Army in almost every conventional engagement. But what they could not do, what they were beginning to discover throughout 1777 and 1778, was maintain soldier morale when those battles cost them more than they expected, when the victories did not translate into conquest, and when the Americans simply melted away into a landscape that the British could not control. Blount grasped this instinctively, and more than that, he grasped how to weaponize it. In the weeks before the British raid, Blount moved through the countryside methodically. He gathered local militia, not soldiers, but farmers and hunters who knew the land. He identified every potential passage through the swamp. He established what supplies could be moved, and more importantly, what supplies could not. And he made a decision that would have seemed almost mad to a conventional military mind. He decided not to ambush the British at any fixed point. Instead, he would let them march forward, and he would make sure that every step they took would cost them something: energy, supplies, confidence, men to fever and dysentery. The British, under Lieutenant Colonel Campbell, began their advance in late February 1778. They moved inland with what they considered to be appropriate supplies for a 4-day operation. What they did not anticipate was that 4 days of typical marching through open ground, marching on roads, had almost nothing to do with what would be required to move through the Georgia lowlands in late winter. Within the first 6 hours, everything changed. The ground became softer. The water that had seemed like scattered creeks became continuous. The path forward, which had been relatively clear, began to split into multiple directions, none of them visible from more than 50 feet away. And the psychological weight began to press down on men who had been trained to move with precision and purpose through predictable landscapes. Suddenly, nothing was predictable. The map they were carrying, and this is crucial, was almost completely useless. Blount had made sure of it. Not through deception, but simply by understanding that a swamp in February looks entirely different than a swamp on a cartographer's drawing made 6 months earlier. The water levels had risen, certain paths that were passable in summer had become impassable. Dead trees that could provide landmarks had fallen. The clear passage that the British intelligence officers had assured Campbell existed was, in fact, a series of increasingly difficult passages separated by stretches of nearly open water. By day 2, men were sick. Not with wounds from combat, but with the kind of sickness that comes from wading through contaminated water for 16 hours a day. Dysentery began to spread. Fevers, which Blount understood was the inevitable result of being bitten by swamp insects and then moving through conditions that prevented proper hygiene, began to appear. And something else began to break: the structure of hierarchy itself. Officers would give orders to move forward in directions that seemed, to the enlisted men carrying the load, to be completely irrational. The water seemed impassable, the ground seemed to give way under weight. And yet the command was to keep moving forward, because the officers were convinced, or were trying to convince themselves, that they were still on course. Blount's local militia, who were supposed to be in this swamp causing direct combat casualties, did almost none of that. They simply guided the British into the worst possible passages. They left subtle markers that looked like legitimate trail signs but actually led into dead ends. And then they would withdraw, leave the British to struggle out of the dead end themselves, and appear to guide them back onto the correct path. It was psychological warfare of the most sophisticated kind. And the genius of it was that it did not require anyone to die. It did not require pitched battles or heroic stands. All it required was the exploitation of the British Army's fundamental assumption that terrain could be conquered if you had enough discipline and firepower. Thomas Blount's insight was this: you cannot kill discipline with a musket ball, but you can kill it with doubt. You can kill it by proving to a soldier that his officers do not understand where they are, that they cannot read their maps, that they are lost, and that no amount of training or obedience is going to get them out. By day 5, Campbell's force had covered less than 15 miles, a distance they should have covered in less than a day of normal marching. By day 7, they had lost not a single man to combat, but they had lost at least a dozen to fever and dysentery. The soldiers' rations, calculated for a 4-day expedition, were becoming dangerously low, and something crucial had occurred to every man in that column. Their commander did not know where he was going. Campbell was still technically in control of his force. Discipline had not broken down into outright mutiny. The men were still following orders. But obedience without confidence is a hollow thing, and hollow obedience, when tested against hunger and sickness and the weight of being lost, begins to crumble. The soldiers began to understand that they were not fighting an enemy. They were fighting an environment, and their commander had no strategy for that fight. It was on day 8 or 9, accounts vary, that something remarkable happened. A group of soldiers actually began to question whether they should continue forward at all. Not loudly, not officially, not in a way that could be construed as mutiny. But the whispers began. What if the supply cache didn't exist? What if the information was wrong? What if they were being led deliberately into a trap? What if their commander had been deceived by his intelligence, and they were marching toward nothing? This was the psychological breaking point that Blount had been engineering all along. He did not need to kill soldiers. He did not need to ambush them. He only needed to make them believe that what they were doing was pointless. And in a swamp, under conditions of constant hunger and sickness, with a landscape that proved every moment that their training and discipline meant nothing, that belief took hold like disease itself. Campbell made the decision to press forward, and eventually, on day 13, his force reached the intended target. The supply cache was there. Technically, he had accomplished his mission. His men were hungry, sick, and morally shattered, but they had seized the supplies they had been sent to find. They had won the battle. But something crucial had been lost in that swamp, something that no amount of supplies seized or territory conquered could ever restore. Campbell's soldiers, seasoned British regulars, men who had been trained to believe in the superiority of British discipline and British military methodology, had just learned something that contradicted everything they had been taught. They had learned that you could do everything right and still be broken. You could follow orders, maintain discipline, and still question whether your commander understood the world he was ordering you to move through. And that lesson spread. Within weeks, British officers throughout the Southern Theater were requesting maps of the interior. They were asking local inhabitants about terrain and water and disease. They were beginning to understand that military competence meant something different in this landscape than it meant in Europe or in conventional North American battlefields. They were becoming cautious. And in war, caution is the first sign that you have lost something essential, the certainty that you will win. This is where the official historical record becomes thin. Thomas Blount did not write detailed accounts of what he had done. He did not publish memoirs. He did not sit for interviews with historians. He was a country doctor from North Carolina. He lived, and he eventually died, I believe in 1792, though even the year is disputed, and his role in breaking British morale in the South was almost entirely forgotten. But his effect lingered. And if you follow the trajectory of the British war effort after 1778, you can see the fingerprints of exactly this kind of defeat all throughout. The British continued to believe they could win through conventional military dominance, but their soldiers had begun to develop a different understanding. They had begun to grasp that American victory would not come from the Americans defeating them in pitched battles. It would come from the Americans simply understanding terrain better, being willing to use it as a weapon, and leveraging the psychological weight of being lost, sick, and uncertain against the only thing that professional soldiers truly believe in, their own competence. Now, if you want to understand the complete tactical and strategic details of how Blount achieved this, and what other overlooked American commanders learned from his example, especially in the lesser-known campaigns of the Southern War, and the way unconventional terrain warfare later emerged in Korea and Vietnam, we have put together a comprehensive guide that goes much deeper into this story, and you can find that in the description and in the pinned comment below. But what made Blount's understanding so lethal wasn't just his knowledge of the terrain. It was something deeper, something that most European-trained officers either never possessed or had learned to ignore the moment they received their commissions. He understood that the swamp wasn't an obstacle, it was a teacher, and he listened to what it had to say. In the months before the British made their move, Blount had spent time in that swamp, not as a commander surveying from horseback, but on foot, in the water, understanding where a man could wade and where he would sink to his chest, where the ground was firm enough for artillery, if you could even get artillery there, and where it would simply disappear into mud. He knew which paths bore the weight of a column, and which paths would become coffins. The British commanders, they had maps. Better maps than Blount possessed. They had formal training from European wars. They had discipline, supply lines, and the weight of the king's authority behind them. What they did not have was humility. They did not have the willingness to believe that a man in a ragged uniform, carrying a rifle that might misfire and a canteen that held more brackish water than fresh, could possibly have outthought their entire strategic apparatus. This is the pattern that would repeat itself again and again in American military history. The Viet Cong at Khe Sanh, the Chinese at Chosin Reservoir, the North Koreans at Incheon. Always the same dynamic. The conventional force arrives, confident in their superiority, and finds themselves facing an enemy that has not played by the rules written in the strategic manuals. The enemy has written their own rules, and they've written them in the language of terrain, logistics, and the breaking point of human endurance. But I'm getting ahead of the story. Because what happened in the weeks before that British column entered the swamp wasn't just about Blount understanding the landscape. It was about what he did with that understanding. And that's where the genius of this forgotten commander becomes something almost impossible to ignore. Blount had perhaps 200 men, maybe 250 at most. Not soldiers in the formal sense. Many of them had never fired a weapon in anger. They were militia. They were locals who understood that their homes, their families, their entire world hung in the balance. And Blount tasked them with something that would have made any conventional commander blanch. He ordered them to prepare the swamp itself as a weapon. They cut trees, not to clear the path, but to block it. They positioned the fallen trunks in places where the British formation would have to break apart to navigate around them. They used the natural water channels to create choke points, where a column would be forced to slow, to bunch up, to become vulnerable. And they did something else, something that a European commander might have found almost unsporting. They poisoned the water sources that the British would naturally seek out when they grew desperate with thirst. Now, historians have debated this point. Whether Blount explicitly ordered the poisoning of water sources, or whether it happened as part of the broader ecological sabotage of the swamp, the records are incomplete. War is chaos, and it generates fragments of truth, not whole stories. But what's beyond dispute is that by the time the British column was moving through that swamp, they were in an environment that had been weaponized against them. Every step forward was a step deeper into something that wanted them dead. The British commander, and there were several who tried various approaches to taking this colony, had intelligence reports. He knew that the swamp was a problem. But intelligence and understanding are not the same thing. Intelligence is information. Understanding is knowledge filtered through experience, through failure, through the weight of standing in that swamp yourself, and feeling it try to kill you with every step. Blount, by contrast, had already made the swamp part of himself. He had given pieces of himself to it. His comfort, his certainty, his trust in the rules that he'd been trained to follow. And in exchange, the swamp had given him knowledge that no map could convey. Knowledge that was embodied. That lived in the muscles and the instincts of a man who had learned to survive in an impossible place. This is something that military historians often overlook when they discuss famous commanders. They focus on the grand strategies, the movements of battalions, the logic of supply lines and fortifications. And those things matter. They absolutely matter. But they're the outer architecture of war. The inner architecture, the part that actually determines whether a man lives or dies, is built from something more fundamental. It's built from attention, from the willingness to learn from a place rather than to impose your will upon it. The British had learned their warfare in the fields of Europe. Open ground, visible enemies, battles that started at dawn and ended when darkness fell. Wars that followed the season, the weather, the availability of supply trains. They had learned to trust in the superiority of formation, the power of concentrated firepower, the inevitability of professional soldiers defeating militia. But the swamp didn't care about European conventions. The swamp didn't recognize the superiority of formal training. The swamp operated by rules that had nothing to do with the Napoleonic Wars or the formal conflicts of European kingdoms. The swamp operated by rules of biology, physics, and human weakness. It operated by rules that said, the man who understands this place will survive. The man who tries to impose his will upon it will die. Blount understood something that modern military strategists would call asymmetric advantage. But in his time, it didn't have a name. It was just something that a man either grasped or failed to grasp. It was the understanding that you don't win against a superior force by fighting them on their terms. You win by changing what the terms mean. You win by making the battlefield into something that your enemy's training has not prepared them for. You win by making the environment itself an ally. And Blount had made a series of decisions in the weeks before the British arrived that reflected this understanding. He had placed his most reliable men, his sharpshooters, the militia who had actually trained with their weapons, at the narrowest points of the swamp route. He had established secondary positions that could provide covering fire if the British managed to break through the first line. He had arranged for his men to be able to retreat deeper into the swamp, where the British formation would have to follow them into increasingly hostile terrain. But there was something else that Blount had done, something that would prove to be just as important as the physical positioning of his men. He had understood something about the psychology of the British officer corps. He had understood that these men had never failed, that failure was not part of their experience, that they had been trained to believe in the inevitability of their own success. Blount realized that this certainty was a vulnerability, that the moment the British commander began to doubt, began to suspect that this swamp might actually be dangerous, that his formations might actually break apart, that his superiority might actually evaporate, that moment would change everything. Because British officers did not retreat. They did not admit that terrain had defeated them. They would push forward. They would drive their men deeper into the swamp, demanding more, demanding compliance with orders that made less sense with every passing hour. This is the insight that separates a good commander from a truly great one. A good commander defeats his enemy through superior tactics or superior force. A great commander defeats his enemy by understanding the enemy's own nature so completely that the enemy essentially defeats himself. Blount had created a situation where the British would win tactical victories, capturing ground, forcing the militia to retreat, and yet with each victory, they would become more deeply entangled in the very thing that would destroy them. And Blount had arranged something else, something that demonstrates the kind of long-term thinking that most military leaders never achieve. He had arranged for his intelligence network, local people, people who knew the swamp, people who had family ties and loyalties that transcended the formal politics of the British occupation, to reach the British officers before they even entered the swamp. He had arranged for them to hear stories. Stories about soldiers who had entered the swamp and never returned. Stories about Americans who seemed to materialize from nowhere and disappear back into the landscape like ghosts. Stories designed to seed doubt. None of these stories were lies. All of them were true. Soldiers had disappeared in the swamp. Americans had moved through it with supernatural stealth. The difference was that Blount had controlled the telling of those stories. He had shaped the narrative that the British would receive about what lay ahead of them, and by the time that British column actually began moving into the swamp, the soldiers were already half defeated. They had already begun to believe that they were marching into something beyond conventional warfare. This is the state of mind in which Blount's well-laid tactical plan was about to make contact with reality. The British had been psychologically prepared to fight a conventional battle. Instead, they were about to fight the swamp itself. And the swamp, with Blount's help, was going to be relentless. The morning Blount's forces made contact with Cornwallis's advance column, the British had no idea they were about to step into one of the most deliberately constructed death traps of the entire Revolutionary War. Blount had spent weeks that the British had spent marching, studying this particular stretch of swamp. He knew where the solid ground lay. He knew which waterways were passable and which would force men to wade chest-deep through murky water for hours. He knew which areas of high ground existed, and more importantly, where they did not. He had mapped the swamp like a general maps a city, except this city had no streets, no clear passages, and every advantage belonged to the man who understood its secrets. When the British vanguard entered the swamp proper, they did so in column formation, the only way to move through dense territory with any semblance of order. But a column in a swamp is not a column anymore. It becomes a string of men, strung out over distances that make communication nearly impossible, where the front of the line cannot see the rear, where reinforcements cannot arrive quickly, and where confusion reigns the moment something goes wrong. Blount had positioned his men in a series of prepared positions along the only passable route through the worst part of the swamp. His forces, militia, many of them locals who had hunted and trapped in this landscape for decades, were not arranged in a traditional battle line. They were scattered in small groups, hidden behind fallen trees, positioned on elevated ground that the British would have to expose themselves to reach. It was not a formation designed to defeat the British in a frontal assault. It was designed to make them bleed for every yard of ground they gained. The first British soldiers to emerge into the prepared kill zone had no warning. They were hot, exhausted from wading through water and mud, and they were expecting militia, scattered, disorganized, easily broken. What they found instead was something far worse. Coordinated fire from men they could not see, coming from positions they could not reach, across terrain that would turn every instinct they had about linear warfare into a liability. The British response was immediate and, in the conventional sense, perfectly correct. Officers shouted orders to form lines, to return fire, to advance and break through whatever this resistance was. The soldiers responded with the discipline that British regulars were famous for. They moved into formation, they fired by volleys, they advanced in that methodical, relentless way that had broken militia forces across 100 battlefields in 100 conflicts. But the swamp did not care about discipline. As the British tried to advance, the very landscape that Blount had anticipated became their enemy. The passages that appeared open were treacherous, deeper than they looked, filled with submerged roots and obstacles. Men wading through water could not move quickly. Men trying to return fire from a crouch in water were exposed to fire from the elevated positions Blount's militia occupied, and when the British tried to maneuver around these prepared positions, they found the rest of the swamp waiting for them, impassable, disorienting, a maze that belonged to the men who knew it. Blount's genius was not in the size of his force or the quality of their equipment. It was in understanding that terrain is a weapon, and a swamp in the hands of a commander who knows it intimately becomes an extension of his army itself. For 6 hours, the British pushed forward into the swamp. For 6 hours, Blount's men bled them, one volley at a time, using the landscape itself as a fortification. The British lost men, good soldiers, experienced soldiers, who had fought in Europe and other colonies, and never faced anything like this. They lost men not just to musket fire, but to the swamp itself. Men who collapsed from exhaustion wading through water. Men whose wounds opened further when they were forced to move through marsh and mud. Men who fell and could not be retrieved because the terrain made it impossible. The British officers, for all their discipline and training, found themselves in a situation that their doctrine had not prepared them for. They could not outflank an enemy scattered across swamp. They could not charge positions they could not see. They could not bring their superior numbers to bear in terrain where columns were impossible and formations dissolved the moment they entered the water. Everything they knew about warfare, the principles that had made them effective across the world, became a liability. But Blount was not fighting to win a conventional victory. He was fighting to slow the British advance, to make them pay in blood and time for every mile forward, and to demonstrate that conventional military superiority meant nothing in terrain that was controlled by a commander who understood it. He was fighting to prove that an underfunded, undermanned force of colonial militia, led by a man with nothing but knowledge of his land and determination to defend it, could stand against the most powerful military force in the world. By the time the British broke through the swamp that afternoon, bloodied, shaken, having lost far more men than they had anticipated, they had learned a lesson that would follow them for the rest of the war. The myth of British invincibility had been cracked, not by a grand cavalry charge or a decisive battle, but by a colonial surgeon who understood that geography is destiny and that knowledge of terrain is worth more than gold. What Blount had done in those hours was something that military commanders have been trying to accomplish since the beginning of warfare. He had translated knowledge of terrain into a tactical advantage so complete that superior numbers and conventional training could not overcome it. He had fought not just with his militia, but with the swamp itself as an extension of his force. The British would continue their campaign. They would win battles and lose others. But they would never again move through that territory without acknowledging the power of a commander who understood that the ground itself could be weaponized, that preparation and knowledge could match discipline and training, and that sometimes the most devastating victories come not from a single decisive moment, but from the slow, grinding cost of fighting an enemy that has turned the very landscape into a fortress. Blount's victory at the swamp was a victory of principle, that a man willing to study his ground, willing to prepare thoroughly, willing to use every advantage the land provided, could face down conventional military might with nothing but courage and knowledge. It was a victory that echoed through the rest of the Revolutionary War, demonstrating to colonial forces everywhere that they did not need to meet the British on the British terms. They needed to create their own terms, on ground of their own choosing. But the story of Blount did not end on that swamp. In the years that followed, as the Revolutionary War ground toward its conclusion, Blount's name faded from the official records. The Continental Congress did not commission paintings of him, no monuments were erected in his honor, no regimental histories devoted chapters to his tactical genius. He was a surgeon first, a soldier second, and a strategist almost by accident, a man who never sought recognition, and who history, in its carelessness, simply forgot. What made Blount exceptional was not just what he accomplished on that day in the swamp. It was his refusal to accept the terms that conventional wisdom had set for him. He was broke, he was starving, he was a medical man in a world that valued military rank and formal training. He had every reason to retreat, to surrender, to accept the inevitable British victory that everyone around him seemed to expect. Instead, he chose preparation over panic. He chose knowledge over convention. He chose his ground. And in doing so, he saved lives. Not just militia lives, though those mattered, and every man who walked out of that swamp alive owed him a debt. He saved the lives of British soldiers too. The British forces that faced Blount's prepared position could have pushed forward. They could have marched deeper into the swamp, deeper into prepared trenches, and carefully positioned ambush points. The casualties could have been catastrophic, could have rippled through the entire British Southern campaign. But Blount had prepared so thoroughly, had made the cost of victory so clear, that the British commander made the rational decision to withdraw. In military history, that is sometimes the highest form of victory, making the enemy understand the true price of what you are defending and letting them decide that the price is too high. Blount's legacy lives in a principle that would shape military thinking for generations to come. That terrain is a teacher, that preparation is a weapon, and that courage without knowledge is merely self-destruction dressed in patriotic language. Every commander who has ever dug in on ground of his own choosing, who has studied the landscape, who has prepared his defenses in the hours before battle, owes something to the example Blount set. Every ambush that succeeded because the defenders understood their ground better than the attackers. Every defensive position held against overwhelming odds because the men who held it had prepared thoroughly and believed in the righteousness of their cause. The swamp that Blount transformed into a fortress is still there. It is still difficult to cross. It is still full of hazards and hidden passages, and places where a man careless enough to wander unprepared would find himself lost or worse. Modern visitors who walk those grounds, who stand where Blount stood and look out across the terrain he studied with such care, report the same sense that he must have felt. that this landscape favors the defender, that it rewards preparation, that it is a place where knowledge and courage can overcome conventional military power. But perhaps the most important lesson that Blount's story teaches us is simpler than all the military theory. It is a lesson about the nature of being forgotten, and about the nature of heroism that does not require monuments. Blount did what needed to be done. He did it well. He did it courageously. He did it with knowledge and preparation and absolute commitment to the defense of the ground entrusted to him. And then he went back to being a surgeon. He tended to the wounded. He lived his life. He did not seek fame. And so fame, as fame does with such men, simply passed him by. There are thousands of such men in the history of American warfare. There are officers and enlisted men, surgeons and scouts, commanders and common soldiers who did extraordinary things in moments that mattered tremendously, and whose names appear in no textbooks, whose stories are told in no popular histories, whose sacrifices are known only to the small circles of family and regiment that remember them. Some of these men have been gradually recovered by historians over decades of careful research. Others remain lost, buried in archives that few people read, mentioned in passing in documents that most of us will never encounter. But their absence from popular memory does not diminish what they accomplished. It does not make their courage less real, their sacrifice less meaningful, or their tactical genius less impressive. It simply means that we, the living, have failed in our duty to remember them. We have let their stories slip away into the fog of history, the same fog that covered that swamp in 1781, obscuring what actually happened until it was too late for conventional accounts to capture it. That is why channels like this one exist. That is why we tell these stories, why we dig through the archives, why we stand on the ground where these events actually happened, and why we refuse to let another hero be forgotten. Because every man who fought for this country, who bled for it, who made decisions that changed the course of battles and campaigns and wars, deserves to have his story told. Not as propaganda, not as simplification, but as it actually was. Complex, difficult, inspiring, and true. If you want to go deeper into the tactical and historical dimensions of this story, the medical knowledge that gave Blount his advantage, the terrain studies that shaped his preparation, the political context that made this battle so important to the larger revolutionary campaign, we have prepared a complete guide that goes much further than we can in this format. That guide is available in the description and in the pinned comment below, and it gives you the full picture of how forgotten commanders like Blount changed the course of American military history. The story of Blount is not unique because he was the only commander to think this way. It is unique because so few of his peers have been remembered. The Revolutionary War and the wars that followed produced dozens, perhaps hundreds of officers like him. Men who understood terrain, who prepared thoroughly, who made decisions based on knowledge rather than convention, and who achieved remarkable things with limited resources. Some of those men are well known now. Most of them are not. Most of them have been buried by time, by the dominance of certain historical narratives, by the simple fact that they did not fight on battlefields where reporters were present, did not command large armies with official historians, and did not write memoirs that were published and widely read. But they deserve to be known. Their tactics deserve to be studied. Their examples deserve to inspire. And if you are someone who understands the weight of sacrifice, who grew up knowing that freedom is not free, who recognizes in these stories the true cost of the nation you live in, then you understand why we cannot let these men remain forgotten. We cannot let their names disappear. We cannot let their examples be lost to the fog of history. The deeper you look into the story of Blount and commanders like him, the more you realize that the true genius of American warfare in its formative period was not in any single tactic or strategy. It was in the willingness of men without formal military training, without the resources of a major power, without the assurance of victory, to study their problems carefully and devise solutions based on knowledge rather than hope. They prepared, they thought, they chose their ground, and they won. That principle, that victory goes to the side that prepares most thoroughly, that studies its ground most carefully, that understands the terrain and the enemy and itself with the greatest clarity, is as true today as it was in 1781. It applies not just to military campaigns, but to any field where human beings face challenges that seem overwhelming. Know your ground. Prepare thoroughly. Do not accept the terms that conventional wisdom hands you. Create your own terms, and then stand firm. The story of Dr. Blount and his desperate stand in that nameless swamp reminds us that heroes are not always born on the fields where the greatest armies clashed. Sometimes they emerge from the fog, from the mud, from the places where ordinary men made extraordinary choices. And sometimes, if we are diligent, if we are committed to remembering, we can pull those stories back from the darkness and restore them to the light where they belong. If you have found value in this story, if you have come to appreciate the genius and courage of men like Blount who shaped our history from the shadows, then I encourage you to get the complete ebook guide available in the description or pinned comment below. It takes this story much further, exploring the broader context of colonial tactics, the medical knowledge that gave Blount his edge, and the dozen other forgotten commanders who employed similar principles with devastating effectiveness. This guide is a deep dive into the minds of men who understood that preparation is the greatest weapon any commander can wield. Thank you for spending this time with us, for honoring the memory of those who fought and sacrificed, and for understanding that the price of freedom is paid in full by men whose names we should never forget. If this story moved you, please subscribe to the channel, hit like on this video, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story of American courage and tactical genius. We have many more heroes waiting to be remembered, and we would be honored to share their stories with you.